How's it going, everyone? My name is Dieugirl, and welcome back to Book 1, Into the Light. Last time we left off, Sparky, Besh, Harry, Ron, and Hermione had been sorted into Gryffindor. And Besh found out about Sparky's unique past, as well as the source of trouble from her memory problems. Now, it's time for part 3, so let's do it. Part 3. Flying Lessons. The next morning, Tiffany woke Besh by tugging on his ear. "What's the matter?" Besh muttered. Tiffany giggled and grinned. "Today's flying lessons. Don't you remember?" Tiffany asked, practically skipping down the steps. Besh nodded, dressed, and went downstairs. When he arrived in the common room, he found Harry, Ron, and Hermione all talking together while Tiffany sat by herself. The Quessa was practically bouncing in her seat with excitement. "Sparky, fly! Sparky, fly today!" she giggled, grinning so she showed her canines. Tiffany was so excited she could barely eat. Finally, the students waited next to a set of brooms. "Good morning, class," said Madam Hooch. "Good morning, Madam Hooch," said the class as they stood next to their brooms. Tiffany managed to control herself, though her tail kept swishing excitedly. "Step up to the right side of your broomstick and stay up," said Madam Hooch. The class did. Harry's leapt into his hand, as did Malfoy's. Tiffany's leapt into her hand, and Besh's did as well. "Now that you've got your broom, I want you to mount it. Grip it tight. You don't want to go sliding off the end. Just rest your tail curved on the end, Miss Regensroth," said Madam Hooch, adjusting Tiffany's tail. Tiffany nodded, apparently eager to please. "Now, I want each of you to kick off from the ground hard. Hover for a moment, lean forward slightly, and touch back down." Before Madam Hooch had even blown her whistle, Neville kicked off too hard, and his broom took off. After rising slowly and steadily a good distance, Neville then fell back to the ground with a sickening crack. "Everyone out of the way!" Madam Hooch shouted, rushing towards Neville. Neville had broken his wrist. As Madam Hooch left, she called, "Everyone keep their feet planted firmly on the ground while I take Mr. Longbottom to the hospital wing. If I see a single broom in the air, the one riding it will be expelled faster than you can say Quidditch." Tiffany's ears folded back, then perked up as a couple Slytherins laughed. "Give it here, Malfoy," said Harry, holding out his hand. "No, I think I'll leave it somewhere for Longbottom to find." Malfoy then took off on his broom. "How about on the roof?" he asked. Harry glared up at Malfoy, then mounted his broom. "Harry, no way," said Hermione. "You heard what Madam Hooch said. Besides, you don't even know how to fly." Harry kicked off, and Tiffany watched, her hands sparking. "Sparky, help!" she said determinedly. Tiffany then mounted her own broom and took off, soon level with Harry and Malfoy. "Give it here, Malfoy, or I'll knock you off your broom!" Harry shouted. "Oh, yeah?" Malfoy asked smugly. "If Harry no do it, Sparky will," said Tiffany, her hands now glowing from rage. Besh wanted to stop Tiff before she got up into the air, but he couldn't, and before he knew it, Tiff was up in the air, threatening Malfoy. "Apparently she doesn't need a protector anymore, just a language tutor, and even then, she won't need one much longer," Besh thought idly before getting a leg over his own broom, before being pulled off by Hermione. "No, Besh, you mustn't. Those three are already in danger of getting expelled. Please don't get yourself into trouble as well." Besh thought about it, then nodded in agreement. Harry and Tiff could handle Malfoy. He would probably be a hindrance. "All right, Hermione," Besh said, as they continued to watch the standoff. Besh then snarled as Malfoy turned in the air and threw the Remembrall high into the air. "One of you catch it, Please, one of you catch it." Tiffany and Harry shot off after it. As if in slow motion, Tiffany swerved around the Remembrall and raised her tail. She then thwacked it towards Harry, who caught it while flipping. As Harry landed triumphantly, the Remembrall in his clenched fist, the crowd erupted into cheers. Tiffany clutched her forehead as a memory came back to her. People were cheering. People like her. With a groan, Tiffany's eyes rolled back into the back of her head. She then leaned over and fell off her broom. She heard faint screams as she began to plummet to the ground. Besh saw her clutch her forehead and then groaned. With a small shiver, he disappeared and was replaced by a huge black panther. He needed speed and jumping power, both of which panthers had. He took off running and leapt through the air and caught Tiff on his back and her broom in his teeth. He landed lightly and crouched, letting Tiff slide off. He placed the broom on the ground and released the panther form, then waited for Tiff to come back around. "That damn memorization. I guess you'll need me for a while yet, after all." Besh didn't have a problem with that. He beckoned Hermione over, who pointed her wand at Tiff and muttered, "Reanimate!" Besh looked at Tiff's face and waited, saying quietly, "Sparky, wake up, please. I need to know you're okay." "Besh?" Tiffany groaned, sitting up. She held her forehead as it throbbed. "Are you all right?" Hermione asked. Before Tiffany could answer, Professor McGonagall shouted, "Potter! Wagenstroth!" Tiffany stood up too quickly and swayed. Besh caught her and held the Quessa steady. "What happened?" Professor McGonagall asked, looking Tiffany over. "Bad thoughts. Sparky fall off broom. Besh catch Sparky. Besh save Sparky," said Tiffany, rubbing her forehead. Professor McGonagall nodded and beckoned Harry, Besh, and Tiffany to follow. Tiffany's ears folded against her head in fear. Was she going to expel them? "Besh, I can't go back to Wagenstroth Manor," Tiffany choked, almost crying. "I can't go home. I just can't. Dad will be awful," Tiffany sobbed. Besh was nearly as worried as Tiff was, but he hid it for her. He settled instead for keeping one arm around her shoulders and said, "It'll be fine. I promise. We're not going to get expelled. You don't have to worry about Takama." If only he felt as confident as he sounded. The three of them followed Professor McGonagall to a classroom, and she popped her head inside and said, "Excuse me, Quell. Could I borrow Wood for a moment?" Besh raised an eyebrow. He didn't think Hogwarts teachers were involved in that sort of discipline. They needn't have worried, though. Wood turned out to be a rather burly fifth year. "Wood," Professor McGonagall said excitedly, "I may have just found you a new seeker, beater, and chaser." Wood raised an eyebrow himself and said to the three first years, "Hello, I'm Oliver Wood. I'm Quidditch team captain this year, and apparently Professor McGonagall thinks you've got what it takes. Is that right, Professor?" "Yes, Wood, yes," Professor McGonagall continued, pointing to Harry. "Young Mr. Potter here flies a broom as well as any I've ever seen before, and he caught Mr. Longbottom's trinket without any problems." She then gestured to Tiff and continued, "And this girl is so aggressive. She flew straight after Malfoy and managed to just barely deflect the thing with her tail. She then batted it fiercely as any beater I've seen before to Mr. Potter." "All right, Professor, but what about this one?" Wood said, nodding to Besh. Professor McGonagall said immediately, "He's fast, and he's strong, and he's daring, and he's good at improvising. If you gave him a quaffle and let him loose, I don't think he'd have much of a problem at all. If he flies anywhere as near as well as he caught Miss Wagenstroth, you may have quite the line-up." Wood looked thoughtful for a moment, then hopeful. "Do you really think so, Professor, even though they're all first years?" Professor McGonagall replied quickly, I'm sure I can pull a few strings. Gryffindor's going to win the House Cup this year. I'm sure of it." "Professor, they still need to try out," Wood said, although he was looked just as excited as Professor McGonagall did. "All right, you three," he said, looking at them. "Meet me on the pitch in 2 days. We'll give you a try-out and see how you fly." With that, he went back to his lesson, and Professor McGonagall went back to her duties. Besh, Tiff, and Harry just stood there for a minute before Besh said, "See? I told you no one would get expelled." "But I've never even played Quidditch," said Harry, as the three walked back to Hermione and Ron. "I'm just happy I'm not going back to Wagenstorm Manor," Tiffany sighed in relief. "What if I make a fool of myself?" asked Harry. Tiffany nodded in agreement. "Dad comes to every Quidditch match. The last thing I need to do is give him a reason to withdraw me from Hogwarts." "You won't make fools of yourselves," said Hermione, after Besh had translated what Tiff had said. "It's in your blood." Later, Hermione took the 4 of them to the trophy room and pointed. On a small shield it read, "James Potter, Seeker." A shield next to it read, "Jessica Hikashino, Beater." Tiffany and Harry grinned to one another. Besh noticed them smiling, and smiled himself. They had nothing to worry about. Quidditch was in their blood. They'd be fine. He, on the other hand, had no reason to know whether or not he was skilled at Quidditch. Hermione, however, was still looking at various other trophies, and her eye happened upon 3 that said Chaser. "Besh, you're going to be a chaser, right? Look at these," Hermione called, pointing to them. Besh walked over and looked at them, and gasped silently. One plaque said, "Ketsi over Rachael." Another said, "Cohesi over Rachael." And the third said, "Alci over Rachael." All 3 plaques said, "Chaser." "I can't believe it. Those 3 are my father, and his brother and sister. They must have been triplets. Why didn't he tell me that?" he wondered, brow furrowing for a second. "Besh, is there a problem?" Hermione asked, her own brow furrowed as she frowned. "No, of course not," Besh said, quickly covering up any confusion or shock. "Look at that. What are the odds that 3 people with the same last name were all exceptional chasers, and they all went to Hogwarts in the same year?" Hermione's expression didn't change, but she nodded in agreement. Then they all went off to Gryffindor Tower to rest up before the rest of their classes. The next day, the 5 of them were at breakfast when Seamus pointed up and said, "Look at that!" Harry, Tiff, Besh, and Hermione all looked up to see 3 owls carrying oddly shaped parcels. They dropped the parcels directly over Harry, Tiff, and Besh, along with 3 envelopes. Besh opened his and read it. It said, "Please do not open your parcel at the table. It contains your new Nimbus 2000. Meet Oliver Wood out on the Quidditch pitch the day after tomorrow." Besh looked at Tiff's and saw that it said the same thing, and assumed that Harry's said the same thing, and that they all had the same package. They all stood up with Ron and Hermione and left to talk before classes started. "I can't believe we've got our own brooms," Besh said, dazed. "And Nimbus 2000s at that," Ron said, clearly excited. "Those brooms are the best ones to date." "What's that, Potter? Wolf girl? Cat boy?" they heard a voice ask. They spun around to see Draco, Crabbe, and Goyle standing there, and Malfoy looking positively green with envy and red with anger. It wasn't a pretty combination. "Are those broomsticks?" Malfoy said, obviously delighted. "You aren't allowed to have those." "They are if they're going to try out for the Quidditch team," Hermione yelled, and Besh snarled in agreement, and Tiff did the same. Malfoy just smirked and whipped out his wand and pointed it at Tiff, who flinched slightly. Besh was in front of her in a second, fangs fully bared, pupils started to constrict to the cat-like slits they got whenever he shifted. Malfoy seemed to back down, but quickly recovered. "Anyways, Potter, Wolfgirl," he said, "I challenge you two to a wizard's duel. My second's going to be Crabbe, and Goyle's is going to be Zambini. Who will yours be?" "I'm going to be Tiff's," Besh said fiercely, and Ron said, "I'm Harry's second." Malfoy just smirked again and said, "Meet us on the 5th floor suits of armor at midnight." "Done," said Besh. Besh said, just as Professor McGonagall came upon them and asked, "Is there a problem here, students?" "Those three've got brooms, Professor," Draco said triumphantly, and Professor McGonagall simply raised an eyebrow and replied, "I'm aware of that, Mr. Malfoy. Who do you suppose got them, those brooms?" Laughing at Malfoy's look of shock and outrage, Besh, Harry, Tiff, Hermione, and Ron all walked off, eager to start their classes. The hours passed, and eventually Besh, Harry, Tiff, and Ron were getting ready to leave, when Hermione said, "You aren't really planning to do this, are you?" "Of course we are, Hermione," Harry replied. "I don't intend to let Malfoy think I'm a coward, and I won't let him think the same of Besh, Tiffany, and Ron." "But you might get caught and expelled," Hermione said frantically. "I can't believe you'd be willing to risk your history at Hogwarts over something as stupid as this." "You may see it as stupid, Hermione," Ron said, "but we see it differently." Hermione just shook her head and stood up. "Well, I guess I'll have to go with you then." "Oh no, please, don't trouble yourself," Ron said under his breath, and Besh smirked. The 5 of them climbed out of the portrait hole, and they set off. They all made sure to keep quiet, though. They didn't want to be caught. They managed to get there without being seen, although they nearly had a very close encounter with Mrs. Norris, Filch, the caretaker's cat. Besh managed to catch her eyes with his own, just make her think another cat belonging to one of the students was roaming the castle. They looked around and didn't see anyone, when suddenly they heard a voice say, "I think they came this way, my pet." It was Filch, apparently talking to Mrs. Norris. "We have to stay hidden," Besh mouthed to the other 4, all of whom nodded, and they began to sneak back, having figured out that Malfoy had tricked them and then tipped Filch off. They had managed to get to the 4th floor when Peeves found them. "Yee! Ickle thirsties!" he cackled, and Harry said, "Peeves, please be quiet." "Should be telling Filch, I should," Peeves said thoughtfully, "if there are students creeping about at night." "Get out of the way, Peeves," Ron said, shoving Peeves out of the way, which apparently was the wrong thing to do. "First years, out of bed!" Peeves bellowed. "First years, out of bed! Down the charms corridor!" The 5 first years looked at each other and ran for their lives. They got to the 3rd floor and tried to go through a door, but it was locked. They heard Filch's wheezing and Peeves whooshing through the air. And Hermione pushed them all aside, pointed her wand at the door, and said, "Aloha more!" The lock undid itself, and the door swung open, and they crowded inside. "Where did they go, Peeves?" Filch asked as he wheezed. "Say please," Peeves replied. "Peeves!" "Shan't say nothing if you don't say please." "Oh, all right. Please." "Nothing." They then heard Filch swear as Peeves flew off, and heard him shuffling out of earshot. "Filch is gone," reported Hermione, although all 5 of them had been listening at the door. Tiffany stopped and began gibbering in rapid Keeson. "Tiff, be quiet," Besh hissed. Tiffany merely pointed ahead. "Canida! Canida!" she whimpered, pointing. "It sounds like Canada," said Ron, looking to the others. Besh followed Tiffany's gaze and remembered one of the Keeson words Tiffany had taught him. "Canida. That's Keeson for—" Besh grew silent as a snort and a yawn was heard. A giant, three-headed dog got to its feet and looked down at the five of them. Instantly, all five of them screamed. Tiffany's quills appeared, and she threw her hands up in front of her face. Besh grabbed the Quessa just as a blast issued from her hands. The dog yelped as the blast hit the middle head and the face. Harry, Ron, Hermione ran outside, followed by Besh and Tiffany. The five of them shut the door on the enraged canine as the door continued to rattle from its assaults. "What do they think they're doing?" Ron exclaimed as they clambered through the portrait hole. "Keeping a thing like that locked up in the school." "You don't use your eyes, do you?" asked Hermione, almost laughing. "Didn't you see what it was standing on?" "I wasn't looking at its feet. I was a bit preoccupied with its heads. Or maybe you didn't notice. There were three." It was standing on a trap door, which means it wasn't there by accident. It's guarding something," said Hermione. "Guarding something?" asked Harry. "That's right," said Hermione, matter-of-factly. "Now, if you four don't mind, I'm going to bed, before any of you come up with another clever idea to get us killed, or worse, expelled." With that, Hermione turned on her heel and marched off to the girls' dormitory. Tiffany looked at them, frowned, then followed Hermione. At 4 a.m. the next morning, Tristina found Professor McGonagall waiting for her. She walked with Besh down to the lawns. By now, Tristina had mastered forming and summoning Kai. "Today we focus on attacks," said Professor McGonagall, setting up a few bullseye targets in the air with her wand. When hit, the sparks that made up the targets would turn red instead of disappearing. "Now, cross your arms in front of your face." Tristina flattened her hands and crossed her forearms in front of her nose. Her silver eyes were steady, focused, and intense. Tristina felt 2 balls of Kai begin to surge into her hands. She decided to try an old move she had learned while in the slave camp. "Cannon!" Tristina cried as she crossed her arms in front of her face so it looked like an X. Small balls of Kai began to swirl around each other at the point where her wrists touched. Soon, 4 tails of Kai began to form around the ball, which was growing, and began to engulf Tristina. "Blast!" Tristina cried, launching the ball forward. The sparks where the attack hit turned red, and Professor McGonagall made a mark on her clipboard. "Try the next target," Professor McGonagall called. Tristina nodded and started to power up once again. After several hours of training, Tristina had hit the targets and everything behind them, but never made a bullseye. As she took a drink of water from a goblet, Professor McGonagall sat down beside her. "Tristina, you seem distracted. Is there something you want to talk to me about?" Professor McGonagall asked. Tiffany looked at Besh and then looked away. Several things ran through her mind. Fluffy, Malfoy's taunts, the trap door Hermione had seen, the howler from Takama. She looked back at Professor McGonagall and shook her head. "Naga." "Where's Hermione?" asked Harry as they sat at the Halloween feast. "Parvati say Hermione could no come out of girls' potty," said Tiffany, her English improving a little since the start of her lessons with Besh. "Hermione cry muchly." Tiffany finished, glaring at Ron. Ron had taunted Hermione about being good with levitating charm. As they continued eating, Professor Quirrell burst into the room. "Troll in the dungeons! Troll in the dungeons!" he screamed, racing towards the staff table. "Thought you ought to know," he muttered before passing out on the floor. Suddenly, the great hall was ringing with screams. "Silence!" boomed Professor Dumbledore. The screams died down immediately. "Prefects will take their houses back to the dormitories. Teachers will follow me to the dungeons," Professor Dumbledore directed. As Harry, Ron, Tiffany, and Besh walked along, Harry stopped them. "Hermione!" he said, rushing back down the corridor. "She doesn't know!" Harry shouted. Tiffany took off at full speed towards the girls' bathroom, towards Hermione, praying she wasn't too late. Besh gasped and then took off after Tiff, Ron and Harry on his heels. "Hold on, Hermione. Please don't let the troll get you. For the sake of Merlin, if you see the troll, don't move," he thought frantically. He didn't know whether any of the others had a plan of some sort. One could only hope. They ran down the corridor, nearly flying, they were running so fast. Besh followed Tiffany, skidding around the corner as they saw a huge silhouette. "The troll," Besh mouthed, and Harry and Ron, who had caught up to them as they skidded to a stop, only nodded in agreement. The four of them tiptoed after the troll, and when they finally caught sight of it, Besh had to keep himself from shuddering. It wasn't the prettiest troll that you ever did see. Tall, lumpy, and grey, it stood at about 12 feet, and its oddly shaped head rested on its shoulders like a small coconut resting on the top of a hill. "Ugh," was all Besh could think. Suddenly, things took a turn for the worst. The troll took its club off its shoulder and swung through a line of stalls with a crash, causing the stalls to shatter as though made of glass. An ear-splitting shriek sounded, causing Besh and Tiff to cover their more sensitive ears instinctively. Harry and Ron, however, looked at each other and ran for the troll, or rather near it, as it turned around and took a swing at them as well. They ducked under it, and Harry picked up a broken pipe and threw it at the troll, making it bounce off the back of its head. Shaking his head as though trying to clear it of a fly, the troll lumbered around. Meanwhile, Besh had gotten to Hermione and was trying to get her to move, but she was paralyzed in fear. Sighing in exasperation, Besh picked up Hermione forcefully and threw her over his shoulder with only a little effort. Hermione was a small girl. He then got her over to Tiff, where Tiff was, and said to Tiff, "Now might be a good time for a Kai attack." But Tiffany couldn't seem to hear or understand him, so Besh, exasperated, shouted, "Use your Kai to knock the troll out, please!" Tiffany looked shocked for a second, then nodded and faced the troll. Besh got an idea to distract the troll and promptly shifted into a panther with a flash of light. He pounced on top of the troll's head and batted it with his velveted paws. The troll started batting around Besh, who looked to Tiff, who had crossed her arms in front of her face. "Cannon!" she called out, and as had happened in her training session, a ball of Kai formed in front of her hands, and 4 others began to form around the center ball. She yelled, "Blast!" and the ball launched forward, catching the troll in the head as Besh jumped off before the troll fell to the ground with a crash. Besh turned back to his humanoid form and said, "Good job, Sparky." Just then, McGonagall and a couple of other professors burst into the bathroom, and Besh, Tiff, Ron, Harry, and Hermione all backed away from the troll. McGonagall opened her mouth, probably to scold them, but Hermione said, "Please, Professor, they came to save me. I thought I could take on the troll, because I've read all about them." It was hard to tell who was more shocked, the professors or the other 4 first years. "Well, Miss Granger, I must say that I am quite disappointed in you. You shall lose 10 points for your error in judgment." Hermione bowed her head, and McGonagall continued, "However, not many first years take on a fully grown mountain troll and live to tell the tale. That being said, Besh, Tristina, Ron, and Harry, you each earn 10 points. Now, come along, before the troll comes to," she said, shooing them out of the bathroom. "Wow, Hermione, it isn't like you to lie to a teacher," Besh said as soon as they were back in Gryffindor Tower. Hermione didn't say a word. Besh frowned and hugged her, asking, "Are you all right?" Hermione smiled sadly and said, Yes, I'm just in a bit of shock. I was nearly killed by a mountain troll, after all." Besh laughed and bid Hermione good night as she went up to her dorm. Tiffany stepped out of the changing room, adjusting her new Quidditch beater gear. She had pads on her elbows and knees, which had to be shrunk due to her thin frame, and shoulder pads on her torso, as well as a stiff, thick rod wrapped around her tail. It was unorthodox, but Wood had insisted on this. This way, Wood had argued, Tiffany could concentrate on flying with both hands and let her powerful tail deal with the bludgers. Her eyes immediately found Besh as she entered the locker room. He was dressed in shin guards and thick leather gloves, as well as bright scarlet robe. Tiffany gave Besh a nervous smile. "You look handsome," she said, pointing at Besh's robes. She then blushed a light rose before Wood called on them to assemble in the broom shed. "Nervous, Harry? Besh? Tiffany?" Tiffany looked up to see Wood looking at the three of them. "A little," said Harry, as Tiffany nodded. "It's all right," said Wood, smiling. "I felt the same way before my first game." "What happened?" asked Tiffany, speaking the little English she knew. Said Wood. "I don't really remember. I took a bludger to the head 2 minutes in, and then woke up in the hospital wing a week later." Tiffany folded her ears back and looked at Besh. "Besh, she began, but stopped when she noticed the door in front of them rise up. Swallowing the lump in her throat, Tiffany mounted her Nimbus 2000 and took off with the Gryffindor team. The match had started off well with Gryffindor in the lead 20-10. Suddenly, as the Slytherins began to grow vicious, the tide turned. Tiffany ducked as a Slytherin player vaulted over her, and she heard Besh cry out. "Besh!" Tiffany roared in Animalese. "Are you—" The Quessa cried out as her broom stopped dead, then rolled. She screamed as she fell, then grunted as Harry, who had been looking for the snitch below her, caught her wrist. "Agia—" Tiffany began in Keeson, before Harry's broom rolled and unseated him. He managed to catch his broom and still keep a firm grip on Tiffany's wrist. While Harry's broom began to try to shake them off, Tiffany's broom had begun to dive for its owner. Meanwhile, in the stands, Ron and Hermione watched in horror as Tiffany's broom caught the Quessa about across the face. Hermione, meanwhile, was scanning the crowd. Soon she spotted something. "It's Snape!" she cried. "He's jinxing Harry's broom!" "What about Tiff?" Ron asked. Hermione spotted a cloaked figure standing in the shadows, staring at Tiffany, muttering. "There's someone down there," said Hermione, pointing. "They're both jinxing the brooms. What do we do?" Ron asked, panicked. "Leave it to me," said Hermione, rushing off. Rushing underneath the stands, Hermione set fire to Snape's cloak and the strangers. Harry and Tiffany's broom stopped jerking and settled. Harry tossed Tiffany towards her broom and swung back onto his own. Roaring, Tiffany intercepted a bludger headed for Harry and sent it screaming back towards the Slytherin end. As Besh scored another goal, Harry crashed onto the ground. Tiffany and Besh hovered above him, watching as he lurched. "Harry!" Tiffany began. However, something popped out of Harry's mouth and into his hands. 1 moment later, Harry held up the object. He had caught the golden snitch in his mouth. "Harry Potter has caught the golden snitch!" "Gryffindor wins!" Madam Hooch had declared. The Gryffindor team swarmed the ground, hugging Harry as they cheered. Tiffany and Besh landed beside Harry and engulfed him in a hug. They had won their very first Quidditch match. Thank you all so much for watching and listening. I have to say, I've loved this, working on this story with my friend Besh, and I'm very sad to see it come to a premature end, but it was worth it. The time we spent together was worth it, and the memories we created with this story, I hope you guys will enjoy as much as we did creating them. Thank you all so much for watching. If you liked the video, please like and comment down below. I really do appreciate it. Take care of each other. God bless you all. and I'll see you all later. Oh, I need a drink. I'm parched.